Cybercriminals are working overtime. Last year in the fourth quarter alone, phishing attacks disguised as COVID testing information increased by 521%. Barracuda has identified 13 types of email threats and how cybercriminals use them to steal money from your company or personal information from your employees and customers. Find out about the 13 email threat types and how Barracuda can provide complete email protection for your teams, your customers, and your reputation. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda.
All right, welcome back to Paul's Security Weekly without Paul. So I'm Doug White, and I got Tyler Robinson on the line. So we're going to do the Security Weekly news segment. Hi, Tyler. Thanks for coming back.
Yeah, buddy. You and me tonight. We'll hold down the fort.
I've got you all to myself. That's amazing. So, all right. Well, don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone directly. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server, and follow us on social media and all our streaming platforms. So be sure and do that. Join Alice Stasalauskas and host Tyler Robinson and Amanda Berlin on April 21st to learn how to gain visibility into your enterprise with Sysmon. Also join Paul Asadorian and Rich Mogul on May 4th to learn how to choose the right architecture for your application. Live attendees at both of these webcasts will have a chance to win a $100 Hacker Warehouse gift card. Be sure and register at securityweekly.com/webcast. Don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. It's all there, so you can go check it out. All right, so this is the news. Yeah, ooh. I know. I was like, it's a little quieter now. We had guests and we had a whole bunch of hosts, and now it's gotten more intimate. We can light a fire and yeah, exactly. I know, sexy. All right. So the news this week, we got all kinds of news stories here. My first news story I put up was hackers can infect more than 100 Lenovo models with unremovable malware. So my first problem with that was the word unremovable. I always get a little nervous about that. But you know, I guess it was two vulnerabilities, 39, 71, and 72, are these same old things we've been seeing for a while, UEFI firmware drivers, which had some purpose in the manufacturing process, which sounds like a maintenance hook, like the old kind of stuff they used to put in mainframe systems that sometimes got left in. If you've ever gone back and looked at the history of hacking, this is some of the earliest hacks on record was people who knew these secret codes or some long string you could type in and become root without any kind of other authentication. But basically, these two problems allowed people to disable things like secure boot. They could change some registers so that they could modify the firmware itself. And ESET found another vulnerability, which was 3970, which would allow you to run a malicious firmware after the machine is put into system management mode. So, you know, this sounds pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, these several of these are of no surprise. Like if you guys have not read some of Eclipsium's latest research, in fact, there was one around screwdrivers, which is talking specifically to these things. These are real threats, and real actors are using them. We recently dug into a lot of the Conti stuff and a lot of the ransomware leaks, and this capability was being actively developed, actively used, and it is part of a lot of the botnets. So we're well past the mode of, hey, this is some novel attack that, you know, some nation state's going to use. No, this is not that hard. Many of us have worked on these boot kits for a very long time, and UEFI has just made that much easier. You've got the SPI access. You've got, you know, coming out of sleep and being able to execute code, bypass the verification of even the flash, and continue to maintain persistence. So getting rid of these and even identifying them is well outside of most companies' threat profile, or even what they're able to monitor and get visibility on. And if you're working in things around Ukraine, and you're part of the supply chain to those countries, like Eclipsium's offering a free tool just for this reason, because it is such a big deal and because it is being seen so much. So this is actively exploited in the wild, and a very real threat to most companies.
Yeah, and I was sort of put off by the term unremovable initially, but then I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, maybe not actually unremovable, but for a lot of people, dealing with
Invisible, maybe.
yeah, trying to deal with some kind of firmware replacement, all this kind of stuff is really beyond the scope of most, at least most of the IT, and not to insult any of you, but I mean, people just don't work with that stuff very much anymore. I mean, there was back in the like 80s. Yeah, in the 80s, we used to work with a lot of this stuff a lot. You had to, because it was just part of, managing the system or whatever. But I think a lot of people don't, have any real clue as to how to manage firmware at that level.
Yeah, I mean, you're really talking about assembly or even lower than that. You're talking about hardware pin-specific chip instructions talking directly to hardware that is getting translated to assembly and being interpreted on the chip or on the processor or on the subprocessor. So all these things are probably way lower than most people are used to going or even have a good understanding. UFEI, for instance, has huge capabilities, and most people that's way past what they're able to even look at or think about. So yeah, this is pretty bad. And the piece that really kind of stuck out in this one, like these are known things, known research. There's a lot of good info out there, but the SPI flash permission piece, where it's able to bypass the reflash from a high privilege mode and maintain itself. That's a little bit scary because, again, without some very specific tool sets and knowledge, you're not going to be able to see that or do anything with it.
Well, yeah, I just sort of sat down with a machine that I had sitting there, and I was like, I was just thinking about it. I wasn't really trying to do it. I was like, how would you reverse this if somebody compromised the actual firmware on the machine? I mean, I don't know if you'd even know if it was subtle. I don't even think you would know it was there. So they could embed a botnet or all kinds of stuff in, that loads with the firmware. And I don't know if you'd even detect it, but I was like, how would you even go about trying to, wipe this, take it down to the like bare metal and bring it back up with a clean firmware if it was preventing you from doing that? Because the firmware they put out was better than the firmware originally that had the compromise in it.
Yeah, especially with things like kernel level drivers, right? Like that has the ability to hide itself from a system that gets slipstreamed and patched on boot process and loaded, and is assumed to be have good integrity and is trusted by pretty much everything. So that network stack gets stood up before boot and gets slipstreamed in. You're essentially allowing that rootkit or whatever code to execute. Basically blinding the system. So yeah, it's a little scary what we're moving into from a kit standpoint.
I put it down to this is one of those where you take the motherboard out and toss it in the trash and get a different one.
Well, this is where that supply chain, like we start to talk about supply chain and supply chain attacks and code integrity. Like you really start to think about how do you validate hardware coming into your organization prior to this. If you're U.S. government and you're running something like GovCloud and metal, like they take very careful care on who they get their stuff from, what scrutiny goes into those images, and what hardware is evaluated. But not everybody does that, and that's going to become a new place that has to be evaluated based on your risk appetite and what information you're handling.
I mean, people may have been building these kind of things into these firmware systems for years too. I mean, because that's a long game kind of strategy. If you just happen to be a hostile foreign nation who happens to control almost all of the firmware and chips and whatever, that would be a long game kind of strategy. Would be to build this stuff in.
That's that Western mind. We've got to get past that Western mind of that 1, 3, and 5 year war that we think is going on, and really take the Chinese approach of evaluating that 300-year war and how long have they been having this capability, how long have they been working this into the technology and supply chain stream in order to have something that's workable for long term.
Because there's nothing more Chinese than the long game. I mean, that's that's like the original Chinese, think about 100 years, 1,000 years, and all these kind of things. And I mean, I really worry about that. It's what?
They're used to dynasties. We in America
it's just like, don't worry about tomorrow. Let's worry about 1,000 years from now. But I mean, that stuff, I don't know. I mean, I grew up with the PC world of being terrified of my firmware, because the slightest problem with your firmware and you were out a motherboard that could not be repaired. I mean, even if you pulled the chips and I had one once, and I was pulling chips and putting
memory transfer between SPI chips.
Yeah, and and I was talking to somebody at a company that sold motherboards, and he was giving me stuff to try, and we were doing all this crazy stuff, and none of it worked. I mean, the thing was just bricked and it was dead, and I ended up throwing the extremely expensive motherboard away. It wasn't a hack; it was just something went wrong with it, and you kind of learn, don't ever mess with the firmware, don't ever play with this stuff, or you're going to be in big trouble, and you're going to be out a $3,000 laptop.
Unless you really, really have to, and then you really want to know all the things. Those old Dell SAN hard drives that you had to flash the firmware to get them to work. And if you had to recover the data, you better know how those work.
When the floppy drive failed while you were flashing the firmware, and then the whole system was bricked forever. Ever had one of those? Yeah, those are real fun. Yep. I had a couple of those way back when I want to lose computers we were flashing, and literally the floppy drive. I think we kicked we'd had a few drinks. I think we kicked the plug out, and it shut down, and it was like, okay, yeah, this is bricked forever. It's never gonna boot ever again. And
the firmware don't move boot process. Everybody don't move. We don't want anything going on.
Oh my
2 minutes, we flash the firmware on the servers.
But yeah, and then patching that stuff, if they release firmware patches, if it's just you and you're sitting there at home and you go, I got a computer to patch, but if you're an enterprise and you've got, and then they have, homogeneous machines, and you've got 3,000 of these things scattered around the world, and you need to patch every single one of them, and you don't know what the impact of the patch is going to be either. I mean, that's always that whole patching dilemma of how do I do this on a large scale?
That's why we're running into. So we've already seen this, and this is already a huge issue. In fact, I think there's even a couple news stories around VMware and what our hypervisors are handling and what the bare metal underneath of those. You think about all the enterprises that are running IPMI and have ILO, DRAC, all of the baseband management systems that always end up on the regular network or an admin network that's accessible by a lot of people. All of those things end up biting us in the butt, but we end up thinking about how do big companies manage those, and how do you flash the firmware? People don't flash or update the firmware. There's a lot of issues around that because you can't take those down, and that is how you manage servers. And there's a lot of servers, running cloud or hypervisor or bare metal applications on them, so they don't get patched.
I was thinking about this the other day because I have 2 hypervisors that are at school, and they're not really pure production systems, but they are. And so one of my hypervisors has about maybe 60 people, so really low end, maybe 60 people that use that thing in a year. But even just patching it is like, when am I going to do this? I literally have to contact all those people and go, you don't have an assignment due this week, right? Or do you? And then one person goes, well, I do. I was waiting to do it. And it's like, okay, well, could you let me know when that's done? And I've got to take this thing down and patch it and then bring it back up. I don't even really know if somebody called me tomorrow and said, Doug, can you help us come up with a plan? We've got all these hypervisors scattered around the world we need to patch. What's a good idea? We've got 24/7 operations here. And, and of course, the obvious answer to that is, oh, we'll use your backup hypervisor and roll over to that while you patch the first one. And they're going, we don't have that. No. And we can't afford a backup hypervisor.
Different cluster versions and VM hardware versions that don't fail over to the proper.
Well, yeah, we had that. So we were trying to patch a VMware machine, and we found out, oh, yeah, we can't actually do this because the hardware doesn't support it. It won't run on the hardware we have. It's too old. And then, you go out and go, well, I got to buy a new server, and that was going to be $8,000, which I didn't have.
That was that big jump from 6.5, 6.7 to 7.0 for VMware.
Not happening.
Just stopped supporting.
Yeah, and that's why people are still running old versions, right? I mean, it's just not as simple as patch it. I know I always say patch it, but then when you go to do it.
Yeah, you really do start to think about how all those things play together and what is actually running on those, and that is why. Oftentimes it is a full hardware replace for even things like IPMI or ILO that runs base management systems. That's why those remain vulnerable, and that is why attacks still happen. It's just you can't replace it without replacing hardware. That's not happening.
And that's a massive challenge. I was overwhelmed with that when I started just trying to map it out, and I was like, okay, I'm going to have to wait till summer. When this is down, and then somebody goes, oh, I'm going to offer that forensics class this summer. Oh, okay, now when am I going to patch this? So we've been playing with that.
Qnap, the Qnap vulnerability was kind of an interesting one. We've seen a few of these recently, but this one, like Qnap's had it. There was a huge ransomware strand. I'm trying to remember what it was. It was the QLock or something like that was ransoming basically home NAS devices. But there's a lot of small businesses that run on these NAS devices, and this new vulnerability that they have warned us about is the UPnP one, which we've been yelling about for years, right? Like UPnP is going to bite someone in the butt, and it is now here.
I hate UPnP. It's another one of those things that when I first saw it, I thought, great, this is cool. I looked at it when it first came out, and I was like, uh-oh, this is not good, because it's all unencrypted. It's old. It's not secure, and it was never designed for what people end up doing with it, right? Because like you were just talking about baseboarding, people push that stuff out onto the internet, and then it's like they're going to get hosed because that was never designed to be used that way. And these NASs were not supposed to be like that either.
Yeah, I mean, it's a convenience for these companies, right? Like they don't have to come up with very specific ports to open up, and the regular user can't really do the port pass through properly and secure that. So they just use UPnP, and it's stuck around and it's still there. So it's the Qnap Crypt is the ransomware that is now built this into their kit, and it is highly effective. So make sure you're disabling your port forwarding on your routers. Make sure you're disabling UPnP on your Qnap under your QCloud. That is the automated router configuration setting. So it's really tough to talk to home users and small business users about this, and I do get calls from them saying, what should we do? And when you look at what they're doing, a lot of times it was just convenience. A lot of times it was set up by some, third-party person who came in and did it for some fixed rate or maybe for free. And the pandemic really pushed this, right? Because it sent so many people home, and they were like, I got to be able to get back into this. And they either port forwarded onto those NASs so people could actually access files from home without VPNs. I saw one of those not too long ago, and I was like, oh my God, this is insane. But you got to use a management network for this, for this. I mean, your NAS obviously has to be on your regular network, but to manage it and to open it up, you need to restrict all that, and you just can't push it out. They've made it fairly easy and intuitive, but it is still, even as a tech person, you get in there and you have to really think through some of these settings and like the auto, like what it's actually translating to, what it's actually saying and doing. Like there's not real distinction between it. And then most of these people are not network architects or even security minded. So designing a home network that's secure, that doesn't have IoT, that's not going to get ransomware, you're not exposing something to the internet. Like all of those things are expectations we cannot put on our end users. We just have to do a better job of figuring out ways, new novel ways to have the same convenience with some security forethought. And that takes innovation, and that takes really getting rid of some of this old stuff that vendors have relied on for so long.
Well, yeah, I actually don't have a Qnap, but I actually have another kind of NAS that was at my house, and I was thinking about it, and I was like, I went to their site and I was looking at the instructions for how to set it up. And, there's never any mention of any of this stuff. I mean, the instructions were obviously designed to make it as simple and quick as possible to put this on your home network, to plug and play, because it's really set up for that. You're not even setting IP addresses or anything. You're just punching it in and saying it's out there. There's a file share. You can go to the file share. You don't have to do it because they don't want anybody calling the help desk. And I was thinking, they really ought to have some guidance here about be really careful. Because I think their assumption was that most people using these are running like regular Soho stuff at their borders, and that Soho stuff at the border typically comes from the factory with most stuff shut down. So it's not port forwarding, it's not pushing things in the network. But I looked at one of those, and their instructions had real easy to use how to set up port forwarding and how to set up, all kinds of UPnP and all sorts of stuff from the internet, and how to use DNS so you could put up a name so you could get to. And I was like, okay, yeah, this is it. But there was never one mention that exposing this is a bad idea.
So Qnap actually did a pretty good job. Like I think after the QSnatch came out, they had some security guidance, but they went down a full recommendation list, and I think they had a little bit of consulting help to do this. And there's some interesting recommendations in there, and they do cover some of the risks between doing different things, and they offer some alternatives, but it is not well laid out, and I think someone really should spend a little bit of time on some of the Soho stuff. Even the commercial routers you buy, you go spend $300 on like a nice ASUS router, and you expect it because it was expensive to protect you better. But really, you're.
But I mean, most people when they buy that stuff, even if it's expensive stuff, they just want to plug it in and have it work. I mean, even into the I got 50 employees kind of stuff, and they're still buying Linksys, and they're still. I mean, not anything against Linksys, but they just want to plug that thing in, plug the internet cable into the internet port and plug the regular network into the other side, and we're good to go. And they don't really have a lot of staff and resources, and they can't afford to hire you and Larry and everybody else to come pen test it. Yep. So then they sit there with it, and nothing happens in 2 or 3 weeks, and then it sits there for years, and they may never ever patch it.
This data is critical. This is data for some individual users. Priceless photos. Some users, this is their books for their small business. Their small business may only be 20 employees, but it has critical books for the last 20 years, and maybe a small vendor for a critical supply chain. Like, we really do have to start thinking all the way down to the Soho, because they are the ones suffering a little bit worse than I think others.
And it's tough to talk to those companies because you go in there with sort of big corporate idea of like, well, first you need to do disaster recovery planning, and what's your approach to this, and what's your strategy, and what are you going to do if you lose your books? How long can you
plug a new hard drive in and have it just work?
Yeah, exactly. I'll call that high school kid that set up our accounting system before, and he'll come back and put another hard drive in. And I mean, I've talked to some of those people, and they don't have any money for this stuff, and it's definitely a scary thing, and it's a tough business plan really for startups or anybody to target those markets, because then you have to go into low cost, high volume kind of deals. And there's a ton of liability there because the support for that is massively crazy. I mean, believe me, I've been in that market space before, and I got out of that market space because I just could not do the support, because then it turns into every time it blinks, they're calling you. And, I'm like, okay, have your tech person do this. And they're like, oh, we don't have a tech person. Can you come? It's tough. We talked a lot about Okta in the past, the Okta attack. Okta announced that they concluded their investigation on this lapsus. How do you say that? Are you supposed to pronounce the $? Is it lapsus $, or just lapsus? Yeah, that's what I thought. But when they do that, it makes it complicated. But Okta said that they fixed this, and they severed ties with the third party company following the breach, which kind of bothered me a little bit. It was like, well, we just jumped in, and this company was called CISA, and they apparently what they released in their discussion was that a CISA support engineer who had access to Okta somehow allowed a phishing attack or a social engineering attack. It didn't say, but they said the attacker had control for 25 consecutive minutes on the 21st of January. They kind of started playing it down and said the attacker accessed 2 active customer tenants within the super user application, which that sounds pretty bad. Well, I'm gonna stick with understatements. It's just like, yeah, that could be bad. And then they said they also viewed limited additional information in certain other applications like Slack and Jira. The attacker was unable to conduct any config changes, MFA or password resets, or other customer support impersonation events. The attacker was unable to authenticate directly into any Okta accounts. I mean, this is a pretty common problem for anybody that's got contractors, right? Or anybody that has employees even.
Yeah, I mean, Sykes and Sitel, that's a massive contracting agent for outsourced help desk. Like, again, this from a social engineering aspect, like, yeah, maybe some better training, some better controls, but there was a lot of things that I believe the onus relied on Okta, and I think they just needed a liability and a scapegoat, so they've wiped it off to the contractors. But this configuration obviously was not well architected, and the fact that this was that easy to gain access to certain things, and it wasn't even a sophisticated hack. So, like, I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of how they handled this one, and I see why they did, because they're such a big, high prolific company, and this was kind of hitting the headlines, but still, it was.
Well, I mean, I've seen this before. One time we had a consultant who got the laptop was sitting on a table in a restaurant, and I don't know what he did. he got up or something, and somebody just grabbed the laptop and took off with it. And by the time he called in and said, my laptop got grabbed, and I said, was it logged in? And he was like, yeah. And by the time we looked at it, the person had logged into the system, and they were changing things and trying to do stuff. And I mean, it's tough if you've got a lot of contractors out there, and the companies I work for, usually issue laptops, and they're restricted to VPNs but even then, I mean, it's restricted to a VPN. If I leave it sitting there logged in, or I download something, or I run something, you gotta limit all that access, because you don't know who these third-party people are, and you don't know what kind of training they're getting. I don't care what kind of rules you have; it doesn't really matter. I mean, some of these companies have tons of turnover.
Monitoring and that defense in depth, like there's always a way in, and there's always going to be a contractor, so there's always what layers of acceptable risk are at each point.
And I mean, help desk is like the lowest, common denominator of all this stuff anyway. I mean, they get the most turnover, they get the most people, and they're always going to be accessing stuff. A lot of times they need access to fairly high level stuff, and doing, role management and segmentation and stuff on those kind of people is really, really challenging, because the more complexity you add to those models, the more training those people have to have, and the third party contractors going, come on, we can't afford to train all these people like that. It's going to cost a fortune. We can't afford to provide the service at the price point we have. And then everybody goes, okay, it'll be fine.
Yep. That's why the delegated roles and actually getting that least privilege and segmentation out of the gate in the design phase is important. You'll see a lot of technical debt for security in those long-standing companies just because they've not addressed that or taken steps to mitigate that. Help desk has to be able to access and change the password and add people to the domain. So we just need to give them domain admin rather than think through that and delegate.
Well, that's probably one shared account too. It's just called like Help Desk A. I mean, I've audited that. I've caught that before.
Shared password vault that has all the help desk stuff that's access to everything.
Seen that. I've seen it where they had people connecting with SSH, and there was 100 different IPs using that SSH account in 1 week period, and you're going, wow. Do these people ever quit or get fired? And they're like, about 7 a week get fired, and we hire new ones. And it's like, oh, and you just give them this same password? Yeah, that's great. And they're like, you know what it would cost if we had to retrain all those people every single week when somebody quits? And I'm like, maybe you could give each one of them a password? I was like, okay. Or don't do that. That's fine. And then you can read this Okta story about yourself. It's a problematic kind of thing. All right. The bug that won't die. This was my bug that won't die story. The cockroach of vulnerabilities, Print Spooler.
Yes. Yes.
Another one. This is 22718. It affects all versions of Windows, because every version of Windows has Print Spooler. It has always had Print Spooler. It will always have Print Spooler. I don't even know how you get rid of Print Spooler. I remember that first one when Print Nightmare came out. I was like, I remember asking, can you even get rid of Print Spooler? I mean, can you just delete it? And the answer is, I don't think so, because it loads, with the driver set for any printer. So unless you have no printers ever, and you manually went in and deleted every single printer or printing type device, including PDFs, it's going to load Print Spooler, and it's going to be right back in there.
Yep. Yeah. So the real advice, like when we're seeing this in a lot of engagements now, we're seeing companies, not running Print Spooler on their domain controllers. Whew, thank goodness. Now we're seeing, maybe 50% or I don't know, maybe 60% are still running Print Spooler on domain controllers or highly privileged. So still an issue. You have to patch. You need to make sure your Print Spoolers aren't running on your domain controllers. That's not going to break anything. The Print Spoolers for local privilege escalation on local workstations, and this one in particular, it is really hard to deal with. You've got to get a local administrator. You need to make sure that you've got those locked down properly. B, you've really got to make sure that your Print Spooler is fully patched with the latest patches, and that is a two-step process. And then this last one, really, I don't actually know what you can do outside of the mitigations that are going to be pushed with the next patch, which I think is in May. So there's a lot of local privilege escalation that will happen. And again, this is actively being exploited. There's a POC within hours of the release of some of this. So it's a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft didn't say a lot about this thing. They said it can only be exploited locally, which is good, but not good.
Yeah.
But and it was a low complexity attack without user interaction. So I guess it's a zero click kind of exploit that if you have local
Basically,
privilege, yeah, you can do that. I mean, I hate this thing. I'm not a fan.
It's an interesting one. It's leveraging the log file drivers, I believe, in this one.
Yeah.
Whereas before we're leveraging the privileges of load drivers at a specific privilege level, which is very, very common, even if you don't have local admin, like the ability to add a driver, whether it's malicious print server driver or not. Like that was part of kind of the design. It was how it was done. So this one just adds another layer of complexity to how we're going to have to ensure that we're blocking this. But at a very minimum, you should have your print spooler drivers off on your domain controllers, and that is the real fix, because you get something like unconstrained delegation in a domain with the print spooler running on a domain controller. That is a one-click total environment being owned versus just a privilege escalation on a local system. So.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, when Print Nightmare came out, I actually went in and I was trying to see what would happen when I had some virtual machines, and I was actually deleting all the print spoolers. But the minute I tried to print anything, it reloaded those drivers. So yeah, on your domain controllers, you can probably get away with that because you can limit it, and because nobody should be using the domain controller for printing, it's fine. But on all these enterprise level systems, all of them have this vulnerability. CISA said that it was actually being exploited in the wild, and they did order all federal agencies to patch this within 3 weeks. So I don't know what happens if they don't, but it's and of course
CISA will come in and patch it for you.
Oh yeah, is that what it is? They send people with the thing to break the door, the battering ram, and it's like, yeah, we're taking your servers now. This is what we were talking about earlier, right, with John, everybody being afraid of the police.
Getting that print spooler turned off on those domain controllers is important. Really, there's almost zero ramification to that. I mean, unless you've got something like printer pruning with inside of Active Directory, which is so rare and almost an unknown feature, it doesn't affect anything with inside of the domain. So just start there, and then there should be a patch, and hopefully we can work backwards a little bit with this one.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's issues when you patch that kind of stuff too, though, if you have a lot of printing operations, especially if they refer to that driver all the time, and it can. So it may not be as simple, but we hope so. So patch it, but hopefully there's not another one next month. MetaMask published a warning that iOS users can have the seeds. Just to know one of these stories, I kind of put these stories up because I thought they were sort of provocative, because in a way they were sort of like, really? Duh. But this one was, they said the seeds of your crypto wallets could be stolen. And I was like, really? How? And then I went and read it, and it was like, well, if you put your seeds in iCloud. And I was like, well, wait, is there a vulnerability in iCloud? But then I read on, and well, yeah, and it said, if you're using app data backup and all the seeds get put in iCloud, and then your iCloud gets compromised, well, then yeah, they can get your seeds because they're there in the iCloud backup. And initially I was like, people's iCloud backups get hacked how often? And I was like, oh yeah, like constantly. Because I've done two different cases. One was a criminal case that was around that. And I mean, the person was, he was just stealing all these iCloud backups, and it was really, really easy, apparently, because you can just, get into that stuff all the time. I mean,
yeah, and I mean, this is one of the reasons that people use MetaMask, right? Is because it is an offline, it's an off exchange, non-custodial wallet, but.
Right.
Then you have to think about where those keys are stored, and you start to think about the mobile device and the backups. Yeah, that backup then becomes very important. So your iCloud becomes very important. You start to think about people that share their iCloud account password with other accounts or even app permissions, and any of those get breached or that data gets dumped, and now that password is available. This is a huge target. This one in particular was targeting a wallet or a firm that manages crypto, and there's was like 21 million people's crypto was being managed by this wallet. It was like $650,000. So it was, a well-crafted fish. They went after a particular target, had spoofed text messages from Apple, and then had a spoofed call. Like, all those things are low-level, low-tech entries. It was the targeting of these specific users was highly interesting. I'm curious how they got that info. If it was, they leaked it online, they had a phone number attached to a business that mentioned that they use MetaMask or did crypto management. Like, that's kind of dumb if that's how that happened. And then you should be using, if you're managing that many people's crypto, like, don't manage it from a damn phone. Like, you should have a cold wallet and a hot wallet, and that hot wallet should definitely not have $650,000 in it. Like, that seems pretty dumb.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think about this earlier today, and I was just like, the chain of stuff that's involved. Because if you have these wallets and they're hot or I don't know what all the terminology, or the hot wallets, warm wallets. Yeah. I mean, if that's on my phone, and I back up my phone, and I back it up to I actually back it up like offline to my NAS, because I like to keep all that stuff to myself. I mean, but if I plug it into iTunes, it backs up. And when I change phones, it backs up. It would be really easy to have this stuff sitting in lots and lots of different places. And then if you got compromised on many different levels, whether it was your password vault or it was something on your system or all these things, it could easily lead to somebody getting hold of this stuff, especially if you foolishly use the same passwords on your backups for your phone that you use on other sites that have been compromised. And it's just like
you're
phishing.
Assuming that using a password on their backups, though, too, right? Like,
yeah.
Google by default backs up. If you install Google Drive and you have a premium account, even on an iPhone now, like, you have the option to back your iPhone up to that, and that's almost all automatic. Any of the Google stuff automatic. Any of the Apple stuff's automatic for the most part. So
I'm sure there's people that are backing up their phone. They didn't even know they're backing up their phones. They just plug it in, and and it happens, and it just and it's getting copied all over the place. And if it's on a shared drive somewhere. People backing them up at work and sharing them. They could be, who knows how many different, locations that stuff could actually be stored in. And then all those low-hanging fruit attacks work really well. I mean,
see, this is the bigger problem. This is not just a MetaMask problem. There are many other wallets and many other forms and a lot of data inside of those backups that can be used for those other wallets. So MetaMask just happened to get called out on this because of a pretty decent fish that got some money stolen. But I imagine it's actually fairly common, and this is going to be more commonplace. This is why things like the Trezor, some of those hard wallets, like making sure you've got a strategy around your hot wallets, around your moving money wallets, which is typically on your phone, when you're buying and selling, you're sending money to people, and then your cold wallets, which should be a hardware offline, and even past the cold wallets. If the cold wallets fail, like your keys, your 12 or 24 secret words, those should probably not be on a piece of paper in your desk where a fire could wipe those out. Wow. Those should probably be on in a fireproof bag or in a safe or on one of the new, crypto keyword laser word matchers. Like, there's a lot of good strategies. You just have to do them.
Well, we used to talk about that a long time ago. I called that a red card system, where we talked to companies all the time about saving. It wasn't about wallets, but it was about the same idea of, they would say, well, all of our root passwords and all of our vault codes and all these things are stored in this safe. And I'm like, okay, what if the building is gone? And they're like, well, it's a fireproof safe. And I'm like, is it? And can you get to it? Is it at the bottom of a pit?
Is that 11 minutes or is that 18 minutes?
Yeah, and is it buried under 100 tons of junk that fell on it when the building collapsed or whatever? And I'm like, we were always trying to get people to come up with systems to put, the penultimate and ultimate passwords and things in an offsite location somehow so that they could do that. And if you're a home user, that's harder to do, because you probably can't hire Iron Mountain to put your stuff in a cave somewhere. But you can, I've told people, put the stuff in a safety deposit box. I know it's old-fashioned, it makes me sound really old, but it does work, and it's off-site. So if you've got long-term stuff like these wallet keys and so forth, put them somewhere off-site that's safe, that you can get to them in an emergency. But if you just stash them all over the place, eventually somebody's going to find one, and then you're done, and that would suck.
Well, I mean, that goes back to your friend Lou. Like Lou lives on with my my disaster recovery plans of, where are all my passwords? If I die, like, does my wife have access to all of the 401k stuff, to the life insurance? Does she know about all the life insurance? Are all those in one place? Could she get access to my crypto wallet if, my technical friends came and helped me? Like, where is that stuff stored, and how do I actually turn that over? So there's a lot of strategy that you kind of have to start to think about, like, even outside of like your living will, health will, like all those things should be done just as basic good human being things to do for your family in case something happens. But there's a lot there.
Oh, I will tell you, you what Tyler says is absolute truth, and you better write it down, because nobody likes to think about that stuff. And the person who did that taught me this was my dad, and my dad had files for every outcome. He had files for, if your mother dies and I'm incapacitated, if I die and your mother's still alive, if we both die at the same time, and he had all these different file folders that had the instructions in it. And, and I was always like, yeah, Dad, sure, whatever. Well, one day my dad did die. And when my dad died, he died suddenly. He was 89 years old, but he died very quickly. Just like one after, he was perfectly fine, and he came home one day and that was it. And guess what? We went to the file, pull the file, every password, every policy, every account number, every single thing that everybody needed. And apparently my dad assumed we were all pretty stupid, which was probably a good idea. But, it actually literally had like steps, like call this number. And I was like, what is that number? My brother's like, oh, I don't know. Let's call it. And we call it. It's hello, Clicks Mortuary. And I was like, hi.
The appreciation, though, you have during those moments, like you don't want to have to think. You don't want to.
God.
It leaves a legacy and a lasting, like it allows that overweight with burden of like figuring other stuff out that
it's like the worst time in your life when you have to deal with this stuff, and having all that stuff done where you just literally followed a checklist and it was like done. And I called this mortuary, and they're like, oh yeah, that was all prepaid and it's all been arranged, and he picked this casket and paid for it in advance, and it's sitting here if you want it, and we can pick up the body and we'll have it all handled, and he's got a grave plot. And it was just like, it was all like took 15 minutes. It was kind of creepy in a way. It was so easy. But when my friend Lou died, it was the exact opposite. It was just like, wow, total chaos. Now, it didn't matter because Lou didn't have any family. He didn't have anybody. And even then, it was like, okay, well, I got to do something here. And like, nobody has access to the checking account. Nobody has access to this. Nobody has access to that. And it was just a giant mess. So do your family a favor and protect your wallets, but also start thinking about bad things, because that's, do a little disaster recovery planning for yourself, and it'll make everybody appreciate you when you're gone.
Yep. Because you may be young and you may think you have time to do it, but like there is never a good time and no one expects it. So
yeah, that's a tough
play that
one.
role and be good at it.
Yeah, I mean, really, that's it's very tough to talk about, I got to say, but your family will appreciate you if you take some action and get it all organized, because they need those passwords. It's really tough when you're calling companies and going, hi, I have a name here and I'm trying to, it sounded like social engineering. I was calling these, like, I'd find a note somewhere that says like Collateral Mutual Inc., 1971. I'm like, is there a policy there with this name on it that I don't really have any of the numbers, and this guy's dead and I can send you the death certificate? But, and attorneys deal with that, but you'll spend a lot of money on attorneys then when you have to hire somebody to do all this.
Yeah, you got to deal with probate attorneys. You got to deal with the state on probate. You've got timing, like you've got to still keep the bills up to date, and then you got timing to get into these accounts and make sure they're not past due. Like all those things, you still have to go on living, and companies really don't care if people die.
And you may never get it back. I had somebody ask me this recently, and they said, my father had this investment account. He's got all this money in it. We have no idea how to access it. We don't even know where it is. He said there was like $1 million in this, but we have no idea where it's located. And they're like, do you have any suggestions? And it's like, Ouija board? It's like really difficult when you don't have any way to actually track some of this stuff down, and like wallets and things like that you don't have keys for are going to be really, really bad.
Hire a hacker and hopefully split the bounty really good, and they don't charge you very much.
Yeah, you're going to have to do that. And even then it may not work. All right.
Yeah, there's some cool tech around that, but make sure you guys do that. There's some cool stuff with like Gmail and LastPass where you don't check in or you haven't logged in like 30 days. Like there's some fail safes. Like even that is better than nothing.
But start thinking about that.
We'll get away from this more.
Morbid as it is, I just start thinking about it. This one, I've been harping on this one for years. I mean, years and years and years. If I should have put this story earlier, but if you use software and hardware that comes from a hostile foreign country, especially authoritarian, dystopian hostile foreign countries that you're at war with or anything like that, it's probably a problem. I mean, I've been saying that since the dawn of time. Even back in the old days when we wrote all our own software and it was written in-house and, we knew what it was. It was like, should we use this algorithm that this guy sent us from Bulgaria? Probably not. But those subtle long game attacks, aside, if the government of a country can call the CEO and say, either give me the data or I'm going to put you and your family in the gulag for a long, long time, forever. And anyway, this story was about how these Russian tech firms are getting crushed. And there's plenty of great Russian people. I know tons of great Russian people who are not involved in any of this. They're just nice people, and they're not responsible necessarily for what their government's doing or anything else. But did you really use Kaspersky? I mean, this when it first came out, I got an ad saying, "Hey, have you tried Kaspersky?" And I looked it up. I was like, "What is it?" And I'm like, "Well, this is a Russian company." And I don't really know that I want to put some Russian software on my machine. And they're like, "Oh, no, it's no problem." And I'm like, "Really? Is it not?" I mean, it's go ahead.
It is pretty sad because they've worked decades to get enough reputation so where maybe they're not widely used in the U.S. I mean, they were getting more popular.
Europe.
They did good research. Their product was decent. But you talk about Europe, you talk about South America. Like there's a lot of very large corporations and enterprises that maybe their U.S. counterparts or U.S. division office uses, Microsoft or whatever, and their South American company uses Kaspersky. Like that's not always a cross the board product adoption.
Yeah.
It's very sad to see this with the sanctions and all the economic stuff that's already coming down the pipe, and then all these tech companies. I mean, between Yandex, you've got Kaspersky, you've got several other big giants down there that don't have a part of this, but you can't trust them because now favors are being called in. There's oligarchy money in there. There's the ability for the government to have their fingers in those and start to. And companies are going to be desperate, so it becomes even a more risky venture to leverage some of those. So I think it is lose for everybody at this point. I mean, it's really kind of sad.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to use mail.ru. I mean, I'm not going to sign up for that. But I mean, vContact and other, or Contacti, or however you say, I don't know how to say that, but it's like a social media platform in Russia that was really trying to move outside of the, the constraints of Russia, and they're all just done. I mean, nobody's going to want to use this.
There's even companies that we forget about that are leveraged, like Any.Run, I believe, the malware sandbox platform on the web that is fantastic.
Uh-oh. I think Tyler might have dropped. Oh, there he is. Sorry, you got frozen there.
I guess other RU platforms that, share the same thing. They're well used, well known, but not known that they're Russian. So
and I think some of them tried to play that down. A lot of them were trying to move off-site essentially to put operations outside of Russia, so they could try to get out from under that. I guess, but like there was that Stoyanov guy. He moved his company. He was with Kaspersky, and he was like an investigator. And I guess he shared some information with the U.S. government about a cyber criminal that was attacking systems or whatever. Seemed like a perfectly normal thing to do. He was based in Singapore, and I guess when he went home to Moscow, he got arrested, and now he was charged with treason. And he's in maybe in the gulag for the rest of his life. That's pretty grim. But
and again, they're going to call in favors, and if you don't abide by that, either your family or you end up in the gulag or. Well,
that other, the one that was in Singapore was Ilya Sakov from Group IB was the name of that company, and he was the one that came back to Moscow and got arrested and charged with. He was another one that was charged with treason. And I mean, Russia's basically got a law now that says that any company designated a, quote, strategic information resource cannot be mostly owned by foreign investors. It has to be held internally, because they know then they can manipulate those people, that they can't like dilute their stock to the point that they can say, well, Elon Musk owns 62% of this, so we don't have to do what the government says. I mean, that's pretty scary.
It's a good way to end up in Lubyanka and down in the basement of one of the rooms.
Yeah. And it's easy to bash Russia, but I mean, China, Saudi Arabia, and all these other countries too are pretty totalitarian, and they can pretty much just step in and say, I don't know a lot about Saudi Arabia, but in China, the government issues your permit to do business, and those permits don't last forever. So they expire regularly. They also issue permits for your house and everything else. So if you cross them, they can just revoke your permits, and of course, obviously, they can just literally step in and say you're charged with treason, you're a criminal. They can put you in jail, they can put your family in jail, and they can do all these kind of things without any real like due process kind of stuff. And that's just about it, I mean, so I really worry about software like that, but I worry more about supply chain stuff, because I know that there's companies providing APIs that are plugged into APIs that are plugged into APIs, and that kind of stuff is a lot more difficult to actually assess. I mean, I can look up and see that Kaspersky is mostly owned in Russia, but I can't necessarily track all these APIs back to I mean, that's what the software bill of materials is supposed to help us with, but I still am waiting to see just how granular that's going to get. Like how much dissection are people going to do on software? Are they going to say, oh, yeah, we use this GitHub library over here, we use that, and we use this other tool, and so on?
Depends on how much you're paying, right? Like if you're using, we're talking about libraries, and then you're talking about, you're paying a lot more for that, and that's probably one thing. But if you're a small chip manufacturer, or maybe you're like, you really don't care. You're looking at the bottom dollar of whatever router that is, or whatever hard drive is holding. So it comes down to cost, I think, at this point.
Well, I'll do as much as I'm required to do, and then I'll stop, because it costs more if I do more. And I don't think it'll probably be another one of these court cases we'll be talking about in years from now about just what did they require, how far did that have to go. I don't think that's been established. Maybe it has. I haven't read the entire grim detail of all that stuff with the software bill of materials, but it sounds very arduous. Like, I can't even imagine trying to dissect some of the software that's out there and figure out exactly what all went into it and where it came from.
Not to mention all the chips and interoperability between those chips and functionality that could be built into each.
Yeah. And then what's it going to break if you take it out? Yeah, it's like, okay, how much is it going to cost to fix this? Yeah, exactly. Along with that, did Elon really want to buy Twitter for $43 billion? So this was the question. And the story, that I wrote that question, but the story was about that Tesla's been having all these problems in China, and that their supply chain is all messed up, and Teslas are made in China like everything else. I mean, every car in the world now is being made in China and assembled. A lot of times they're assembled in the U.S. or somewhere else, but they're usually the parts are made in China. And China's a totalitarian dystopian state. It's capable of doing whatever they want on short notice, and they can do stuff. They can affect your business. They can put out a really good example of how China works is they wanted everybody to quit smoking. So used to, if you went to China, everybody smoked. I mean, there was smoke everywhere, every planes, trains, automobiles, buses, restaurants, everybody smoked. And China wanted people to quit smoking. And of course, Mao was very famous for smoking, and they still sell Mao brand cigarettes and all that. But, when they wanted people to quit, they just started going, they put out some little notices like, it would be better if you didn't smoke. And everybody that's like a, career professional was like, ooh, put the cigarette out. Because your career could be limited if you're the person that doesn't, do good things. And they did that with spitting, too. There used to be a lot of spitting problems in China, and they sort of said, it's not good and not healthy to spit, which was true. But today they can just say stop, right? I mean, they can say 停止, which means stop, and then everybody stops. And so last year they made 936,000 Teslas, but production right now is pretty much stopped. I mean, they can't get the charging stations, they can't get the cars, they can't get anything because China said, COVID's a big issue, and they shut down the factory. And Elon doesn't like COVID, as we've all heard from him. But in spite of all that, he's not getting this. So my question was, do you think that he was like trying to? He said he was going to take over Twitter, which I don't think he's actually going to do, and he was going to turn it into a bastion of free speech. But was this just like to deflect all this from people asking questions about Tesla? That's very cynical.
I mean, I think he's a very vocal billionaire who sometimes gets bored and has a crazy idea. Like, I'm sick of Twitter monitoring or changing tweets or having such big control and having a wide reach. So, and hey, it wouldn't be a bad time to tweet out that I might want to buy it because that might deflect some of the news. But I really think that's probably a side thought based on his personality. Like, he's got to find a way to deal with the supply chain, and he's very practical, very logical, and the numbers matter a little bit because he's got boards and funding and all that, but it matters very little, I think, in his logical brain in something that's going to come out in the tweet. So I think that was more of a, hey, let's see if we can put a dollar number around this. Now we've got a precedence for a dollar number. They might have said no, but they kind of looked at it, so that means that they aren't opposed to a number, or they are. And hey, if I do it, then that also is better publicity. And now we've got a new platform for revenue and speech.
And that's where I got to too. I mean, I was thinking it through, and I was just like, so what's he really trying? And I was like, I think it's really just he can do whatever he wants. I mean, he can do or say anything he wants, and nobody can do anything to him. I mean, he's like the richest guy in the world. So, I think he just thinks up something. He wakes up at 3 in the morning or at 3 in the afternoon or whenever he wakes up or whenever he's not waking up or whatever. And he goes, you know what? I ought to buy Twitter. Puts it out there.
I mean, think about you and me. Like, you think about how ADD and like all over the place and the wild ideas we have. Think if you had unlimited resources and budget and people that could do that, like, shit, I would say I want to buy Twitter. Like, that would definitely be at least, a 5 or 6 time a year occurrence.
Well, yeah, I mean, can you imagine if anybody actually listened to anything I said? It would be like crazy. I'm just like, I'm going to buy a balloon.
And the crap you say,
yeah, it's like, and that was where I got to too. I was like, I think it's just Elon saying whatever he wants to say. He doesn't care because there's not a lot of consequences to him. I mean, if Tesla shares go up 10% and go down 10%, so what? It went up, it went down. It'll go back up again tomorrow. I'm not worried about it. I'm just going to say whatever I think. And if he says I really like whiskey, unlike me, who nobody's listening to, Elon says it, and he says, I'm going to buy up all the whiskey in the world and pour it in the ocean. Everybody goes, oh my God, and they just run on whiskey, and then later he just says, what? Oh, I don't know. It was a wild thought.
I was drunk on whiskey.
Yeah, I was hungover. I was hungover, and I was like, we got to get rid of this crap. No more bad whiskey. We're pouring it all out. But I mean, for me, it would just be.
Like it was a no-lose situation, though. Like, if Twitter had actually considered the offer and it was a decent number, then hey, he ends up with a company, and like, yeah, it costs him a little bit of money, but like when you're talking about the kind of money these guys play in, like that would have been a profit and or worth whatever he paid for it. So it's publicity enough in and of itself. So it was a win-win for him to say.
Oh yeah, he doesn't lose very often. So it's definitely, there was no downside to it for him. I mean, it's like if Twitter stock goes up or down or backwards, it's just another part of the game. So so what? If you lose 20 million this afternoon, so what? You make 30 million tomorrow, or 2 billion. Or I mean, the numbers with him are kind of insane. So it's a little crazy. This one, Google tracked 58 exploited 0 days in 2021. I mean, that was exploited ones, according to the article. I didn't remember that many, but that's what they said. I think most of them were pretty obscure. There was only 2 that were listed in here as being really, really bad. And I think a lot of them overlap too, but they said there were 17 use after freeze, 6 out of bounds read and writes, 4 buffer overflows, and 4 integer overflows. But the biggie ones were the 0-click vulnerability and iMessage, which was what they used for Pegasus. I mean, that was one of the main vectors for Pegasus infections. And there was an iOS sandbox escape bug that was there. And the only comment I wrote about this story was, "Is it time for Brave?" I was like, that's what I wrote on here.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, even with Brave, right? Like, that's Chromium based, and we're still dealing with base OS. Like browsers are the next OS. They're the next weak link in the OS stream for whatever we're doing. But you think about this list, like I'm surprised there was only 52. I can think of a lot that were being exploited. Microsoft Exchange being one of them. There were several there. There was quite a few with in 21. And we had the Print Nightmares. Serious
this
Sam.
was the 58. The 58 was just in Google.
Oh
no,
shit.
not total. Just in Google Chrome. Yeah, that was just on one app. I do agree with you that that browsers are the new OS. I really do think we're almost there. We're getting really close to just the browser is going to be the whole world, and underneath it is going to be something you never see or deal with, and people don't hardly ever deal with it now.
Yeah, I mean that's why we can have things like Chrome OS, and you look at a lot of the ransomware and a lot of the kits, malware kits, and even our C2 that we develop is almost all relying on browser, WebSockets. A lot of the newer JavaScript, all of these technologies we've had to migrate to because the browser is so widely used for most day-to-day operations. Like the OS is,
it's a great environment to code in. I mean, it's a standalone window that it's on everybody's desktop, and it's very standardized. So instead of popping up windows in the system itself, you can just write it in a browser, and it doesn't really matter what the OS on the back end is, and it's so much easier to code that way. I mean, I know that's when I want to write a windowed app. I mean, I'm immediately going to write it in that model because writing those old-fashioned Windows apps where you have to pop open a window and all that is just like so yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see a lot more. We'll see a lot more viruses, a lot more kits and malware. Yeah. They're already there. They're in extension. Yeah. They're leveraging the browser.
And then when you start thinking about how many different components there are in a browser, it's just like absolutely crazy. I mean, there's so many pieces of that thing that's running. I really enjoyed this story because it Windows 11 is getting close to being used by as many people as are currently using Windows XP.
Wait, what?
Yeah. So they did this study, and they looked at they looked at 20 million computers that have agents installed on them, I guess, for like network scans or whatever. And they found out that only 1.44% of the computers in this study, and it was like 20% enterprise and 80% end user, only 1.44% were using Windows 11. Now 80% of them were using Windows 10, so that makes sense. Windows 8 had 1.99%, Windows 7 4.7%, Windows XP. So this was the number. 1.71% were still using Windows XP. So Windows 11 hasn't quite caught up with Windows XP at this point. Windows 2000 had 0.15%, and this was my favorite one of all. Vista, one of the most hated operating systems of all time, 0.04%, which is about 8,000 computers in their study, was still running Vista.
Windows 2000 is still beating Vista.
Windows 2000 is still beating Vista. Yeah, I'm like, okay, poor old Vista. Boy, did that thing tank. I hated that.
That's very interesting. One, I think the more interesting piece of this is that there are 10 million computers using LANsweeper app, and of those 10 million people, that data has now made it back to them in order to fingerprint. Which was a recent acquisition by Fing, which is another network scanner for your mobile device. So where's that out of?
Yeah, exactly. So scary. But it was a funny story because I was looking. I was like, I could not believe that there was people running Vista, or that this tool from Fing would actually run on Vista. I was also like, really? This thing must be pretty versatile. It'll run on Vista and Windows 2000.
Oh man, LANsweeper has been popular for two decades now.
Well, I know, but I guess they're running those really old versions. It was like the modern version of LANsweeper actually run on Vista. I couldn't even get stuff to run on Vista when it was new.
I was going to say that probably crashed that driver all day long.
But I will tell you, I thought about this story as well, and I was thinking, a lot of people, they buy a computer, and they set that computer in their house, and they use it for whatever, and they run whatever comes on it. and they don't upgrade it, and they don't mod it, and they don't patch it. It just sits there. I mean, when I said, when my dad died, we fished these computers out of his house that he still used. One of them was running Windows XP, and he didn't want to upgrade it because it ran some stuff that wouldn't run on anything else. It was stuck on Windows XP forever. So, the only other story I had that was really kind of interesting was this story about immersion cooling. Did you see that one?
I did, and I know a bit about it, and I know the place that they're doing it and the company, and it's a pretty small district. I mean, it's only, I think, 50 megawatts. It's not a huge crypto. Okay, it's pretty big for probably this company, but like you're talking about crypto colos and crypto locations, like most big investors for crypto, when we're setting them up, we're probably not looking at anything less.
It caught my eye because I was really, I was like, oh, I remember those aquarium tanks with the oil in them and all this kind of cool stuff for cooling. And I thought this would really be fun to set up some of these things because I wanted to build one of those oil-based ones one time. And Lou and I actually he had all these old aquariums, and we got one of the aquariums out, and we were trying to figure out what kind of oil to put in it, and it was like mineral oil or something, and you put the motherboard down in there and run it. And we got started with it, and then it was like, do you realize what a mess this is going to be? Because I knew we were going to turn this thing over at some point, or it was going to fall through the floor, because we were also thinking about the weight of like 50 gallons of mineral oil. I was like, that's going to be kind of heavy. And and all this, but I mean, I know it's not what they're doing with this immersion cooling for the crypto center, but I was interested in the story because of all the other weird ways people try to cool stuff.
No, I mean, it's not far off. Like you end up with a mineral.
No, I mean, I could really see like server racks and things that come, with this kind of cooling, built into them, and they're just, it's all self-contained and some kind of solution.
It is nice for crypto because you end up with things like environment variables where you lose fans on crypto. You can up firmware and get better performance. Like there's companies using different variants of the cooling. Like 3M makes some amazing immersion cooling raises. And there's companies like DCX that build all these encompassing ASCII coolers that are all rack mountable and beautiful. But the cost comparison right now, it's market suffering from stocks going down and sanctions and stuff, and mining coming, that proof of work versus proof of stake stuff coming in. There's been a lot of investors very hesitant on deploying mass amounts of crypto, we'll say in the last 2 months. Like before that, you couldn't buy enough power. I was buying up every piece of power in the country trying to help the investors get a hold of it. But it's interesting now. So we'll see how this plays out. Yeah,
I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, it's like some of it felt real old-fashioned to me. And I was thinking about old, we used to have old hard drives and stuff that were floating in liquid nitrogen and all kinds of weird cooling. And we had some water-cooled mainframes and big plumbing pipes attached to them and all kinds of stuff to keep them cool.
Still a big thing for data centers. Like you talk about power for fans and noise and the cooling of a data center. Like if you can do that in liquid and use dry air coolers and have that immersion, and even have something that maybe immerses into underground where you're using geothermal. We've tried to design several systems around that, and it is very cost effective if you can get it done. It's hard to do at scale.
Yeah, I mean, I used to have a bunch of loud servers in my office, which is another reason I'm half deaf. But firearms and Vantech tornado fans is probably why I'm so half deaf. Well, that and guitar music, but all that stuff adds up. Do you have any other stories you wanted to talk about?
No, I think those were the major ones. I mean, we should probably. It would be nice to have everyone else on. We will cover the Java vulnerability that is a 10, and I'll talk about it this week, but I think it'd be fun to have some banter and a little bit extra around it, because that Java one is very, very funny and very bad.
Yeah, well,
I think it's being underplayed to the exponential amount like this. This is pretty bad.
Yeah, I did do that story on the news the other day, so yeah.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, so it was getting out there. All right, well, thank you, Tyler, for being here, and thanks everybody out there for joining us on this edition of Paul's Security Weekly without Paul, and I'm sure we'll see you next week. So with that, I will say good night and over and out, and see ya.